It all started with a text message from my cousin Lila. "Oh yeah, Ryan's coming back next week. There's a huge thing planned." I nearly choked on my coffee. A huge thing? What did that even mean? But before I could ask, she added casually, "You're invited, right?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. No one had mentioned it to me. Not my parents, not Ryan himself. Nothing. Just silence. When I finally worked up the courage to ask my mom about the party, her response was colder than I expected. "Oh, it's mostly under control," she wrote back hours later. "We thought you were busy with work." Busy with work. That was it. No apology, no explanation, just a dismissal wrapped in passive indifference. And then it hit me. They hadn't forgotten. They'd chosen to exclude me. The days leading up to the party felt like walking through quicksand. Every notification on my phone made my heart race, hoping for some last-minute invitation that never came. Instead, I scrolled through endless Instagram stories of Ryan hugging our parents beneath golden string lights, dancing with his fiancée Clara, and raising a champagne glass while everyone cheered. My name wasn't mentioned once, not in the captions, not in the speeches, not even in the background chatter. It was as if I didn't exist. That night, sleep didn't come easily. When it did, it brought nightmares. In one vivid dream, I stood outside our family home, watching through a window as Ryan held court in the living room. He was surrounded by smiling faces, laughing at something he said. Then he turned to look at me, his expression hardening. "You weren't good enough," he said loudly, his voice echoing. "You didn't belong here anyway." The scene shifted, and suddenly I was falling, plummeting into darkness, clutching at memories of everything I'd sacrificed for him, for them. I woke up drenched in sweat, the weight of reality crashing down on me. How could I have been so blind? All those years of paying his tuition, covering his rent, wiring money when our parents claimed their accounts were frozen, it wasn't just financial support. It was emotional labor too. I sold my vintage guitar, the last piece of my father I had left, just so Ryan could afford his student flat deposit. I stayed up until 3 a.m., refreshing embassy websites because he lost his passport before finals. And now? Now he didn't even think twice about leaving me out. The betrayal cut deeper than I cared to admit. I wanted to scream, to confront them, to demand answers. But instead, I packed my bags and booked a luxury train ride through the Canadian Rockies. If they wouldn't include me in their story, I'd write my own. The train hummed beneath me like a living thing, its rhythm steady and hypnotic. Outside, the Rockies stretched endlessly, their peaks dusted with snow that glimmered under the sunlight. For the first time in years, I felt weightless, not just physically but emotionally. Every mile we traveled further from my family was another layer of suffocating obligation peeling away. But it wasn't until Eleanor sat across from me at dinner that I realized how much I still carried inside. Eleanor was older, her silver hair pulled back into a loose bun, and her eyes sharp with wisdom earned through pain. She introduced herself casually, as if boarding luxury trains to escape life's burdens was an everyday occurrence. Over duck confit and red wine, she told me about her husband, a man who had controlled every aspect of her existence for decades. "I stayed because I thought that was love," she said softly, swirling her glass. "But sometimes, Alex, letting go isn't betrayal, it's survival." Her words hit me harder than I expected. Survival. Wasn't that what this trip was supposed to be? A chance to breathe without feeling like I owed someone something? Yet here I was, clutching my phone even though there was no signal, half expecting some desperate text begging me to return. Ryan's face flashed in my mind, his laughter during the party, oblivious to everything I'd done for him. The silence between us wasn't peaceful, it was deafening. "You're running too," Eleanor observed, her voice gentle but firm. "What are you leaving behind?" My throat tightened. How could I explain years of sacrifice reduced to invisibility? Instead, I simply nodded. "Maybe it's time to stop defining myself by what I've lost," I murmured. Her smile was small but knowing. "Then start today." It started with small favors, things I told myself were normal for an older brother to do. When Ryan called me in tears because Clara, his fiancée, was considering leaving him, I didn't hesitate. "I'll handle it," I said, as if those words weren't already carved into my identity. The next morning, I booked her a $1,400 flight to London, making sure the email confirmation came from Ryan's address so he wouldn't feel ashamed. She went, They made up, and Clara posted a glowing Instagram reel captioned, "When he does everything to make it work." Of course, I wasn't tagged. But that was just one moment in a long list of sacrifices I made while Ryan was in London. Every time he panicked about rent or tuition, I transferred money without question, money I'd saved for my own future. My condo dream, gone. My emergency fund, drained. And yet, every transfer came with fewer messages back. At first, Ryan would call me weekly, full of gratitude and updates. Then the calls became monthly, then sporadic texts. Eventually, even his responses dwindled to one-word answers. Thanks. No explanation, no acknowledgement of what I'd given up. The worst part wasn't the silence. It was realizing how disposable I had become. Once, when Ryan lost his internship and couldn't pay rent, I pulled $3,500 from my savings account. Did he ask? No. He assumed I'd step in, like always. That assumption gutted me more than anything else. It wasn't just financial support. It was emotional labor too. Late-night phone calls where I calmed him down after exams. Hours spent deciphering visa forms he refused to touch and selling my vintage guitar, the last piece of my father, to cover his deposit. For what? To be forgotten? Looking back now, I see the pattern clearly. The more I gave, the less I mattered. By the time Lila casually mentioned the party, I was already invisible to them. All because I kept showing up, kept sacrificing, kept believing I owed them something. They never saw me as Alex, only as utility. A walking bank account. A shadow assistant who existed solely to prop up their golden boy. And now? Now they wonder why I walked away. The party was everything I wasn't. A glowing spectacle of golden lights, laughter, and champagne towers. Clara stood at Ryan's side, radiant in a silk dress, smiling for photos as if their life together was flawless. But beneath the surface, cracks were forming, cracks that would shatter everything they built. It started when Clara stumbled across something she shouldn't have, my bank statements. Hidden in an email chain Ryan had forgotten to delete, the truth unraveled like a thread pulled from fine fabric. Every payment I'd made, the wedding venue, the planner, the photographer, was linked to my account, not his. At first, Clara thought it was a mistake. "Why does Alex's name keep showing up?" she asked him casually one evening. His response was evasive, dismissive. "He barely helped," Ryan lied. "Just small stuff." But Clara wasn't satisfied. She dug deeper, uncovering a Google Doc titled Alex Emergency Plan. Worst case, a step-by-step guide Ryan had prepared to deflect blame if I ever confronted him publicly. The betrayal hit her like a freight train. All those months, she believed Ryan was financially stable, independent, even proud. He had been living off me, lying about where the money came from while pretending to be self-made. When Clara left him, it wasn't quietly or privately. She posted a scathing expose online, detailing how Ryan manipulated both her trust and mine. "I married a man who stole from his own brother," she wrote, her words dripping with fury. The post went viral overnight, painting Ryan as a fraud who relied on my sacrifices while erasing my existence entirely. Calls flooded in, from friends, distant relatives, even strangers accusing the family of exploitation. By morning, Ryan's golden boy image lay in ruins, reduced to ash by the very lies he'd spun so carefully. For once, I didn't feel guilt. I felt vindicated. The family house smelled like bleach when I walked in, the same one where Ryan's party had been held just weeks earlier. The air was thick with tension, as if even the walls knew what was coming. My mother greeted me with forced calmness. "We need to talk this out, Alex," she said, her voice tight. But it wasn't a conversation, it was an ambush. "You've been childish," Mom began, pacing back and forth. "You made a scene by not showing up to your own brother's party. Do you have any idea how humiliating it was to explain to guests why you weren't there?" Her words hit me like shards of glass, sharp but hollow. Humiliating for who? For us. I shot back, my voice rising. Before she could respond, Dad stepped in, his face red with anger. "Enough. This isn't about money or parties. It's about respect." He slammed his fist on the table so hard that the glasses rattled. "You're jealous of Ryan. You always have been." His accusation landed like a bomb, silencing everyone except me. "Jealous?" I laughed bitterly, the sound cutting through the room. "I paid for his tuition, his rent, his damn engagement ring. Does that look like jealousy to you?" I pulled out my phone, opened my banking app, and turned the screen toward them. $48,600. Is this what you call being sensitive? Is this what you call making a scene? Lila, sitting quietly in the corner, finally spoke up, her voice trembling. I knew, she admitted, tears streaming down her face. Ryan told me not to tell Alex, because he won't mind. Her confession hung in the air, heavy and damning. I stayed silent because I didn't want to lose anyone. That was the breaking point. Without thinking, I grabbed the family photo from the mantel, Ryan at graduation, me cropped halfway out, and threw it onto the floor. It shattered into pieces. I'm done, I said, my voice steady despite the storm inside me. Done helping. Done paying. Done being quiet. The room froze when I pulled out my phone and opened the banking app. $48,600. That's what I'd given Ryan over 3 years. Money for tuition, rent, flights, Clara's engagement ring, even groceries when he claimed his account was frozen. I turned the screen toward them, letting the numbers glare back like an accusation. Does this look sensitive to you? My voice cracked under the weight of years unspoken. No one answered. Not Mom, not Dad, not even Ryan, who sat there pale and trembling, his golden boy facade crumbling before my eyes. This stops now, I said, standing up. The chair scraped against the floor with a sound so sharp it felt like a knife slicing through their silence. I told them everything would change. No more shared credit cards. No more automatic payments. No more pretending I didn't exist while they celebrated him. I deleted myself from every joint account, changed passwords, canceled subscriptions tied to my name, and left the family group chat, the one where I'd been invisible for years anyway. When I announced I was cutting off all financial and emotional support, Dad tried to intervene. You're tearing this family apart, he shouted, veins bulging in his neck. But his words hit me differently now. They weren't threats, they were admissions. For once, I wasn't afraid of losing them because I realized they'd already lost me. As I walked out, I paused at the door. I'm not your ATM anymore, I said quietly, looking at Ryan. And I'm not your brother until you figure out how to earn that title back. Then I stepped outside into the cold night air, leaving behind the toxic web I'd spent decades weaving for them. Each step away felt lighter, as if I were shedding layers of obligation that had suffocated me for too long. This time, I wasn't running, I was choosing freedom. The fallout hit like a storm after I walked out of that house. Ryan, once the golden boy with an unshakable smile, crumbled under the weight of his own lies. Within days, he stopped answering calls, even from Clara, who had moved out and refused to look back. My mother's voice became a haunting presence in my inbox. You've destroyed this family, she wrote, her words dripping with guilt rather than concern. Each message was another attempt to drag me back into their chaos, but I didn't budge. Then came my father's texts, short, sharp jabs meant to wound. Your brother hasn't eaten in 2 days, he typed one evening. Are you happy now? Happy? No. Free? Yes. For the first time, I wasn't weighed down by their expectations or their manipulation. I let their messages sit unread for hours, sometimes days, before deleting them without reply. Lila broke the silence differently. She called late one night, her voice trembling. I messed up, she admitted, choking on her words. I knew they were cutting you out, and I didn't stop it. I thought if I stayed quiet, maybe I'd still belong. Her confession felt raw, like she was ripping off a bandage too tight around her conscience. Ryan told me not to tell you about the party. He said, Alex won't care, he's always busy anyway. Hearing those words stung more than I expected, but I didn't lash out. Instead, I thanked her for finally speaking up. Meanwhile, the group chat exploded into chaos. Mom posted cryptic quotes about forgiveness. Dad accused me of being selfish. But none of it mattered anymore. They weren't fighting for me. They were fighting for control over what I represented. Money, sacrifice, invisibility. And now that I'd taken that away, they were lost. It was past midnight when the pounding on my door started, a desperate, uneven rhythm that echoed through my quiet apartment. I froze, staring at the peephole. Ryan. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot, and his tie hung loose around his neck like a noose. He reeked of whiskey and despair. Alex, he slurred, his voice trembling. Please, just let me in. For a moment, I almost opened the door. Almost. But then I remembered everything. The years of silence after every transfer I made. The way he'd erased me from his life while taking everything I offered. the party where my name wasn't even worth mentioning. So instead, I stood there, arms crossed, watching him crumble. I messed up, he sobbed, sinking to his knees as if gravity itself had betrayed him. I didn't mean for any of this to happen. I thought you'd always be there. I thought. His voice broke, and for the first time, I saw him as he truly was. Fragile, selfish, and utterly lost without someone to prop him up. You chose this path, I said coldly, my voice cutting through his hysteria like a blade. You lied to Clara, manipulated me, and acted like none of it mattered until it all fell apart. Now live with it. His head snapped up, tears streaming down his face. But I'm your brother, he shouted, his voice raw with desperation. No, I replied, stepping back from the door. You stopped being my brother the day you decided I wasn't worth inviting to your perfect little world. He stayed there for what felt like hours, pleading, crying, begging for forgiveness. But I didn't budge. Finally, he stumbled to his feet, defeated, and staggered into the night. As I locked the door behind him, I realized something. Forgiveness wouldn't fix us. Not this time. This wasn't about repairing bridges. It was about surviving the wreckage. For the first time in years, I woke up without an obligation weighing me down. No texts from Ryan asking for money. No guilt trips from Mom about family duty. Just silence, and it was deafening. At first, the emptiness felt foreign, like shedding a second skin I'd worn for so long I forgot it wasn't mine. But slowly, I began to fill that space with small acts of defiance. Breakfast alone at a cafe where no one knew my name. Jazz streaming through earbuds as I walked through the park, deleting the family group chat. The one where I'd been invisible for years anyway. Then came the photo. It was from the train ride through the Rockies, the glass dome framing endless peaks dusted with snow. The caption came to me in a flash. If they don't put you on the guest list, make your own destination. I hesitated before posting it, unsure if anyone would care. Within hours, the post exploded. People shared it, commented on it, even messaged me privately. This is exactly what I needed to hear, one stranger wrote. Another said, thank you for reminding me that being excluded isn't the end. It's just the beginning. But not everyone celebrated. My mother called it mocking the family publicly. Dad accused me of dragging our name through the mud. Lila forwarded screenshots of the chaos in the group chat. Ryan silent, Mom ranting, Dad muttering something about ungrateful children. Yet none of it touched me. Their outrage only proved how much they'd underestimated me. They thought I'd crumble under their disapproval, but instead, I stood taller. That night, sitting in my apartment, I stared at the photo again. The mountains loomed large, untamed, and indifferent, a mirror of how I wanted to live. Free, unapologetic, and true to myself. For once, I didn't feel like a shadow assistant or a walking ATM. I felt like Alex. Exactly 1 year after I boarded that luxury train through the Rockies, I stood in a small gallery downtown, surrounded by photographs I'd taken during my journey. Each image was a fragment of my healing, a snow-dusted peak bathed in dawn light, a winding river cutting through emerald forests, and endless skies that mirrored the quiet freedom I'd fought so hard to claim. The exhibit wasn't large, but it didn't need to be. It was mine, untouched by anyone else's expectations or demands. For once, I felt like an artist rather than someone who simply existed to support others. Clara arrived halfway through the evening, her presence unexpected yet strangely comforting. She looked different now, less polished, more grounded. Her hair was pulled back into a loose bun, and she wore no makeup, but there was strength in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I saw your post, she said softly as we stood beside a photo of jagged cliffs under storm clouds. It made me realize how much I owe you. For everything. Her words caught me off guard. You don't owe me anything, I replied, though my voice betrayed the weight of emotions I still carried. I do, she insisted. If it weren't for you, I might never have seen Ryan for who he really is. You gave me clarity when I needed it most. We talked for hours that night, sharing stories about the lives we'd rebuilt after walking away from the chaos they left behind. There was no guilt, no obligation, just two people finding solace in mutual respect. Then, just as the crowd began to thin, I saw him. Ryan stood near the entrance, his silhouette framed by dim streetlights filtering through the glass doors. He looked older, thinner, his shoulders slumped as if carrying invisible weights. His eyes found mine across the room, and for a moment, time froze. I expected anger, resentment, maybe even regret, but all I saw was exhaustion. He didn't approach me. Instead, he lingered at the edge of the crowd, watching silently, as if waiting for permission to step closer. But I didn't give it. Turning away, I closed the gallery door and drew the curtain, shutting out the world outside, including him. That night, as I packed up my photos, Clara placed a hand on my shoulder. "Do you think he'll ever change?" she asked quietly. I shook my head. "It doesn't matter anymore. I've stopped waiting for apologies or explanations. What matters is what I choose moving forward, not what they leave behind." As I locked the gallery behind us, I realized something. Forgiveness isn't about letting someone back in. It's about closing the door without looking back. And this time, I chose myself. The story of Alex isn't just about betrayal or exclusion. It's a lesson in survival. For years, I convinced myself that love meant sacrifice, that family meant enduring the unbearable because blood is thicker than water. But what happens when your sacrifices are invisible? When the people you've given everything to, your time, your money, your silence, forget you exist? That's not love, it's erasure. And for so long, I let them erase me. When Ryan called me crying after his second exam in London, I stayed up all night calming him down. When Clara thought about leaving him, I spent $1,400 on a flight and never told him it came from me. Every action felt like proof that I was doing something meaningful, something noble. Yet none of it mattered, not to them. They didn't see me as Alex, only as utility, a walking bank account, a shadow assistant who propped up their golden boy while fading into the background. By the time they stopped inviting me to their lives altogether, I had already lost myself. What I learned through this journey is simple but brutal. Unacknowledged sacrifice doesn't build bridges, it builds resentment. It hollows you out until there's nothing left but obligation. The moment I realized my name wasn't even mentioned at Ryan's party, it hit me harder than any insult ever could. Not because I wanted applause or gratitude, but because it confirmed what I'd feared all along. I didn't matter. To them, I was replaceable, disposable. But here's the twist. Walking away wasn't destruction, it was creation. Turning off those auto payments, deleting myself from shared accounts, leaving the family group chat. It wasn't just about cutting ties. It was about reclaiming myself. For once, I wasn't asking permission to exist. I wasn't waiting for an apology or begging for recognition. I chose freedom over forgiveness, silence over explanation. And in that silence, I found healing. True love isn't blind sacrifice, it's boundaries. It's knowing when to say no, when to step back, and when to prioritize yourself. Love isn't swallowing disrespect for the sake of unity. It's standing firm in your worth, even if it means burning bridges. Because sometimes, fire clears the way for new growth. Now, sitting in my apartment months later, watching sunlight stream through my windows, I feel whole again. My phone buzzes less often now, and when it does, it's usually spam. No guilt trips from mom, no desperate texts from Ryan. Just peace, a quiet kind of happiness that feels foreign but right. If anything, this story proves one thing. You can't pour from an empty cup. So fill yours first. Protect it fiercely. And remember, love should liberate, not suffocate.